What none of them at Havenwood Manor knew was that the quiet young man in the plain white t-shirt was about to become the reason one woman spent the rest of the night alone at the coat check, doing the hardest math of her life, math that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with who she decided to become in front of 200 witnesses. Simone's voice, light but unmistakably cutting, carried across the ballroom floor. "Nothing about you says you belong here," she said, and the room laughed along with her, not loudly, just enough. Elias Thorne stood alone near the tall windows overlooking the Austin skyline. A plain white t-shirt, dark jeans, a drawstring bag over one shoulder like he'd wandered in from a gym rather than a $30,000 ballroom, his posture straight and unbothered despite the glances already sliding toward him from every direction. To understand why a young man dressed like that would be on the guest list at all, we have to go back to a promise his father made him keep every single year, a tradition that had shaped Elias's understanding of the world more than almost anything else his family's wealth had ever given him. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now let's begin. Havenwood Manor sat on a bluff above Lady Bird Lake, its ballroom rented for the night at a figure that told you everything about who was inside before you ever stepped through the doors. Chandeliers hung heavy enough to strain the ceiling brackets. Flower arrangements cost more than most people's monthly rent. White peonies flown in that morning and arranged by a florist who charged by the hour rather than the bouquet. Photographers moved through the crowd capturing designer labels and gleaming watch faces, valets sprinting outside between luxury SUVs like it was some kind of competition, headlights sweeping across the manor's stone facade every few minutes as another guest arrived. Tonight belonged to Whitney Radcliffe, marrying Xavier Lennox in front of 200 guests who had all learned, at some point in their lives, to wear their money like armor. The security guard at the front entrance had worked events like this for 11 years and knew the type on site, who belonged and who was testing the door. His name tag read Dale, and he'd developed, over a decade of standing at doors just like this one, an almost instinctive sorting system for who needed a second look and who could pass through with a nod. When Elias walked up at 8:47 p.m., the guard's hand moved, before his brain fully caught up, taking in the plain shirt, the worn sneakers, no watch, no chain, nothing that announced anything at all. "Who are you here for?" the guard asked. Elias looked at him, calm, no apology in his posture. "Radcliffe wedding," he said. The guard hesitated, glanced at the line of 200 guests stacking up behind him, each one impatient in their own particular way, and stepped aside, already deciding he'd blame the coordinator if it turned into a problem. Elias walked in, and the room noticed him immediately, not warmly. People didn't stop talking about him, so much as start talking about him quietly, the particular way people talk when they want you to know you're being discussed, but can't quite prove it. He heard fragments of it drifting past. Is he lost? Maybe he's staff. Check his badge. Someone should say something. Each comment landing somewhere just below the surface of politeness. He crossed to the far end of the room near the windows and stood there alone, his posture straight, his expression still, not performing calm, but genuinely holding it, which somehow unsettled people more than nervousness would have, as though his ease in the room was itself a kind of provocation. Simone Radcliffe, 26, the bride's younger sister, spotted him from across the room mid-laugh, with two friends, a champagne flute in one hand, that she'd barely touched all evening, more interested in the way it caught the light than in drinking it. "Who is that?" she said, not really a question, her voice pitched just loud enough to draw the attention of everyone near her. Her friend Ivy Chastain, 25, squinted toward the window. "He came through the front door," Ivy said. "I saw him." In that, Simone's eyebrow lifted, something cold moving in behind the amusement on her face. She handed Ivy her glass and crossed the floor. Ivy Chastain had known Simone since middle school, close enough to recognize every register in her voice. And something about this one made her stomach tighten before Simone had even reached the window. She'd noticed the same coldness in Simone a handful of times before, at other events, aimed at a caterer once, a delivery driver another time. Always someone the room had already quietly decided didn't belong. And every time Ivy had told herself it wasn't her place to say anything, that friendship meant staying in your lane even when the lane ran somewhere uncomfortable. She'd grown up a half step below Simone's family financially, close enough to be invited everywhere, but never quite forgetting the gap. And some part of her had learned early that pointing out Simone's occasional cruelty carried a risk to her own place in that friendship she wasn't sure she could afford. She stayed rooted near the bar, watching, telling herself the same thing all over again. Simone stopped 2 feet in front of Elias, close enough to claim the space between them like her family had rented the whole floor, which technically they had. "Hey," she said, pleasant in the particular way a warning can sound pleasant. "Can I ask what you're doing over here?" "Attending the wedding," Elias said. "Attending," she repeated, glancing down at his shoes and back up to his shirt, letting the assessment last exactly long enough for him to feel it, the way you might look at something you were deciding whether to bother with at all. "I'm not trying to be rude," she said, which was already the least kind way to open a sentence, "but this is a private event, and I'm going to need to see your invitation because I've genuinely never seen you before in my life." "I don't have a printed invite," Elias said. "I was called directly." Simone laughed, a short involuntary sound, glancing back at Ivy and another friend who drifted closer, both of them watching now, with the particular attentiveness of people who sense a scene is about to happen and don't want to miss it. "Called directly," she repeated, dropping her voice into a register that turned the phrase into a joke. "Nothing about you says you belong here," she added, and the small cluster around her laughed along, not loud, just enough to land, the sound settling over Elias like something physical. Elias said nothing. "Look," Simone said, softer now, like she was doing him a favor. "This is the Radcliffe family event. Do you understand what that means? Do you know whose wedding this is?" "Whitney Radcliffe," Elias said. "She's marrying Xavier Lennox. They met at UT. He proposed at Enchanted Rock." Simone's smile flickered. "You probably read that somewhere online," she said. "I didn't," he said. "Then who invited you?" "Xavier," Elias said. The smile returned, bigger now, sharper. "Okay," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling Xavier over right now because I think you wandered into the wrong venue or the wrong city or something." Xavier Lennox was 29, taking photos with Whitney's grandmother when his phone buzzed against his hip. He read the message twice, a slow smile spreading across his face, handed the grandmother his champagne without explanation, and cut across the room, without hesitation, weaving between clusters of guests who didn't quite register what was pulling him away from his own grandmother-in-law. Elias was still watching the skyline through the window when he heard the footsteps behind him. "Thorne," Xavier said. Elias turned. Xavier crossed the last several feet, with his arms already open, pulling him into a hug that lasted long enough for everyone nearby to register it fully, long enough that the small cluster of onlookers went quiet all at once. "I've been looking all over this place for you," he said. "Why didn't you text me when you got here?" "Didn't want to bother you on your night," Elias said. Xavier pulled back, studying him, an expression somewhere between disbelief and affection. "Are you serious right now? You fly in, and you're standing alone by a window? Come on." The room had gone quiet in a spreading circle around them, the DJ's soft music suddenly the only sound left. Simone stood exactly where she'd been standing, phone still in hand, the message to Xavier already answered by his sudden absence from the grandmother's side. Xavier noticed her face. "Did something happen?" he asked. "No," Elias said immediately. "No," Simone echoed half a beat later, her voice thinner than she meant it to sound. Xavier looked between them, clearly aware something had, but tonight wasn't the night for it. "Come meet Whitney's dad," he said to Elias. "He's been asking about you." They walked off together, the crowd parting, without quite meaning to. Ivy came up beside Simone, still holding both champagne glasses. "Do you know who that is?" Ivy asked. "No," Simone said quietly. "I just asked one of the coordinators," Ivy said, pausing long enough that Simone could feel whatever was coming before it arrived. "Elias Thorne. As in Thorne Media Thorne." Simone felt something drop through her chest. "Say that again," she said. "His father is Roderick Thorne," Ivy said. "Like the Roderick Thorne." Simone said nothing. Everyone in that room knew the name. 3 consecutive years on the national wealth rankings, an empire spanning hospitality, technology infrastructure, and media that didn't need to announce itself, because it never had to. "His only son," Ivy said quietly. It took roughly 17 minutes for the energy in the room to fully shift, word traveling the way it always does at events like this, fast, dressed up as concern. "Did you hear? That guy in the white shirt, Roderick Thorne's son?" She didn't know, said it right to his face. By the time Roderick himself walked through the entrance at 9:15, the room had already begun quietly reconstructing itself around the new information, conversations pausing mid-sentence as heads turned toward the door. Roderick Thorne walked in, without fanfare, dressed in a simple gray blazer, salt and pepper hair, the kind of stillness that made a room settle rather than tense. When he entered it, nothing about his entrance suggesting the scale of what his name actually represented across 3 separate industries and countless boardrooms most of the guests in that ballroom would never step inside. Marcus Radcliffe, the bride's father, met him at the door and shook his hand for a long moment, saying something Elias couldn't hear from across the room. Roderick scanned the room and found his son, within seconds, crossing toward him, without pausing for small talk or the champagne someone tried to press into his hand, his path through the crowd direct and unhurried at the same time. He put a hand on the back of Elias's neck the way fathers do, when words aren't quite enough. "You should have told me you were already here," he said. "I was fine," Elias said. "I know you were," Roderick answered. And something in the simplicity of it told Simone, watching from across the room, exactly how many times this exact scene had played out before, how practiced this particular tenderness had become between them, over years of exactly this test. Simone had watched Roderick Thorne walk straight past 200 wealthy strangers to the boy she'd laughed at 20 minutes earlier, watched the way the whole room tilted slightly in their direction. And she understood now, fully, what she had actually done. She'd had 2 glasses of champagne and hadn't finished either one. The dress that had felt perfect an hour earlier now felt too bright, the room too loud, every conversation around her suddenly grating in a way it hadn't been 10 minutes before. She found a quiet corner near the coat check and stood there by herself, waving off Ivy, when she tried to follow, needing a few minutes alone with what she'd just done before she could face anyone, even a friend. There was, underneath Simone's cruelty, that evening, one detail that complicated her, as a person rather than a villain. She had grown up in exactly the kind of rooms where appearance functioned as information, where a person's clothing, watch, and posture told you, within seconds, where they ranked and how much attention they deserved, a system she had absorbed so early and so completely that she rarely noticed she was running it, the way you stop noticing a hum you've lived beside your entire life. Her own mother had once sent her back upstairs to change, before a family dinner, at 11 years old, for wearing sneakers that weren't the right ones, a small lesson repeated so many times, over the years in so many forms, that it had simply become the water she swam in rather than anything she'd consciously chosen. She wasn't cruel by nature. She read constantly, volunteered twice a month at a youth center downtown, held real opinions about things that mattered, the kind of person who would have been horrified to hear herself described as unkind. She had simply forgotten, for the length of one careless conversation, a truth she'd actually known for years, that appearance was never information at all, just habit dressed up convincingly enough to feel like judgment. Standing by the coat check, she made a decision the way decisions sometimes arrive, not like a light switching on, but like a weight settling into place, sudden and impossible to set back down once it landed. She was going to walk over and say it out loud, not because it would fix anything, some things don't get fixed, only survived, but because she didn't want to be the kind of person who walked away from what she'd broken. Elias was standing with Xavier and 2 of Marcus Radcliffe's business partners when he saw her coming across the room. He recognized the change in her posture immediately, shoulders lower, no champagne, no friends flanking her this time, walking with none of the certainty she'd carried an hour earlier. Xavier saw her too, and went quiet, his earlier warmth toward Elias replaced with a wary attentiveness to what might be about to happen. She stopped in front of Elias. "Can I have 2 minutes?" she asked, to him only, not the group. Xavier made a small gesture to the others, and they drifted away, leaving the two of them near the edge of the dance floor, while the room moved around them. "I owe you an apology," Simone said, her voice steady, though the steadiness clearly cost her something, her hands clasped in front of her like she needed somewhere to put them. "I talked to you like you didn't belong here. I made assumptions about you based on what you were wearing, and I made sure you knew I was making them. That was mean. It was wrong. I'm sorry." Elias didn't answer right away. She held his gaze, because not looking away felt like the least she could do, the ballroom noise continuing around them, as though nothing significant were happening in this particular 6 feet of space. "I'm not asking you to say it's fine," she added. "It isn't. I just needed to say it." The music played softly somewhere behind them. Elias was quiet long enough that the silence started to feel uncomfortable. Then he said, "Do you actually believe that, or are you apologizing because you found out who my father is?" Simone felt the question land exactly where he'd aimed it. She didn't rush to answer, actually thought about it. "Both," she finally said. "And I know that's not a great answer, but it's the honest one." Something shifted in his expression. "Okay," he said. "I believe you." He paused. "And yeah, I forgive you." Simone exhaled, not realizing until then that she'd been holding her breath. "Why?" she asked. "Because being angry about it doesn't accomplish anything," Elias said. "And because you came over here when you didn't have to. You could have just avoided me for the rest of the night." "That's not how I was raised," she said. "Me neither," he said. A pause opened between them, not empty, full of something that hadn't existed 20 minutes earlier. "Your father," she said quietly. "I've watched him in interviews. He seems like the real thing." "He is," Elias said. "He's also the reason I came tonight dressed like this." Simone frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He glanced down at his shirt. "He makes me do this at least once a year," he said. "Show up somewhere in clothes that give nothing away, no name, no status, nothing to hide behind. He calls it the honest test." "Of what?" she asked. "Of the room," Elias said. And she asked, "What did the room do?" Elias looked at her steadily. "You were there," he said, and the words landed, with more weight than either of them had expected, the two of them standing quietly, with that for a moment, before the music pulled the room back around them. Ivy watched the exchange, from a distance, close enough to see Simone's shoulders finally come down, from around her ears, far enough to give them the privacy the moment needed, her own thoughts churning the entire time about every previous instance she'd let pass without comment. She thought about the times, before this one, the small cruelties she'd watched Simone deliver to people the room had already quietly written off. A caterer once, a rideshare driver who'd shown up 5 minutes late to another event. And about her own silence every single time, telling herself it wasn't her place. When Simone finally walked back over, eyes red but composed, Ivy said the thing she'd been swallowing for years. "I should have said something a long time, before tonight," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Not just about him. About all of it." Simone looked at her for a long moment, something passing behind her eyes that looked almost like relief at finally hearing it out loud. "Yeah," she said. "You should have. Both of us should have done a lot of things differently." Ivy nodded, and something between them shifted too, quieter than what had happened, with Elias but real in its own way, the beginning of a friendship built on slightly more honesty than the one they'd had an hour earlier. Roderick found his son near the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and the younger guests had drifted toward the bar, the two of them standing near the same window Elias had claimed hours earlier. "How was it?" he asked. "Different this year," Elias said. "Different how?" "Someone actually came back and apologized," Elias said. "Genuinely, I think." Roderick looked at him, studying his son's face the way he might study a contract he wanted to be sure he'd read correctly. "You believe her?" "Yeah, I do." Roderick was quiet a moment, then said, "That's rare." "I know," Elias said. "What did you do?" "Forgave her," Elias said, and told her why. Roderick nodded slowly, and put his hand on his son's shoulder again, the same place as before, and left it there for a long moment, the two of them looking out at the same skyline in the same silence that had apparently become a kind of family language between them over the years. The last thing Simone saw before leaving the venue was Elias standing, with his father near the window, looking out over the skyline. Two men with the same posture, the same stillness, like it was something you could inherit rather than learn. She got in the car and watched the venue shrink in the back window, thinking about the room, about how it had arranged itself around what it could see, and ignored everything it couldn't, about what it actually cost to look at someone honestly instead of at the version of them their clothes suggested. The natural consequence arrived on its own, within the week, without Elias or his father lifting a finger to cause it. A guest near the bar had filmed the entire exchange on her phone, unbothered by the small crowd around her, thinking little of it at the time beyond the mild entertainment of watching a scene unfold. And the 12-second clip of Simone's tilted head, and the words "nothing about you says you belong here" made its way quietly through the same social circles Simone had grown up trusting completely, shared first between three friends who'd been at the wedding, and then further out, into circles she'd never quite mapped. She'd been asked, months earlier, to co-chair a downtown children's hospital gala alongside two other young women from families like hers, a role she'd genuinely wanted and had been looking forward to discussing at the very wedding, where this had happened, one of the few volunteer commitments that had felt like it actually mattered to her rather than simply another obligation to perform. The invitation was quietly withdrawn the following week. No confrontation, no public accounting, just a brief note from the gala committee citing a shift in co-chair composition, the kind of soft, deniable consequence that never announces itself as punishment but lands exactly like one anyway, arriving by email on a Tuesday afternoon, while she sat alone in her kitchen rereading it 3 times before she fully understood what it meant. 3 weeks later, Simone sat in on her regular Tuesday shift at the youth center downtown, where she'd volunteered for 2 years, the same fluorescent-lit room, with mismatched folding tables that had always felt more honest to her than any ballroom ever had. A 14-year-old boy in an oversized hoodie walked in late, headphones around his neck, sitting in the back, without meeting anyone's eyes, the posture of someone who'd already decided this room would be like every other room. A couple of the other volunteers exchanged a glance, the kind that suggested someone should probably handle him, before he became a distraction. Simone pulled up a chair and sat beside him instead, close enough to signal she wasn't leaving, but far enough not to crowd him. "What's your name?" she asked. He looked at her sideways, suspicious, waiting for whatever came next, the same posture she now recognized from a ballroom 3 weeks earlier, though she doubted he'd believe her if she told him so. "Dre," he said. "You doing okay, Dre?" "Yeah, okay," she said, and didn't push. She just stayed there. After about 10 minutes, he started talking, quietly at first, then more. And she just listened, asking nothing more than the questions that kept the door open rather than closing it. She never told anyone about that night at the wedding, never turned it into a story about her own growth, never posted about it, or mentioned it at another party, not even to Ivy beyond the 2 sentences they'd already exchanged that same evening. She just carried it. Some lessons don't need an audience. The ones that actually change you usually don't. And Dre kept coming back every Tuesday. After that, gradually taking his headphones off a little sooner each week, gradually looking up a little faster when someone new walked through the door. Narrator reflection: what stays with me isn't the reveal or even the apology. It's the 4 seconds Simone spent actually thinking before she answered Elias's question honestly. "Both," she said, when he asked whether she meant it or was just reacting to his father's name. And I keep coming back to how rare that particular honesty is. Most people, caught in that exact spot, would have picked one answer and committed to it, either the clean apology or the defensive deflection. She gave him the messier, truer thing instead. The Harvard Implicit Association Project has spent decades documenting how automatically we sort people by appearance, often faster than conscious thought can catch up to correct it, not because people are secretly cruel, but because the sorting happens before the thinking does. Simone wasn't lying when she said she wasn't cruel by nature. She was describing something closer to an unexamined reflex, the kind that only becomes visible once it's pointed directly back at you. What I keep sitting with is that nobody made her walk over to that coat check corner and then cross the room again. Nobody but her own discomfort with who she'd just been. So here's what I keep asking. When you catch yourself running, that same sorting reflex quietly in a room where nobody's watching closely enough to call it out, do you say something anyway?